Daily Detroit is brought to you by the community. Support our work at patreon.com/dailydetroit.
Hello, friends, and welcome to your Daily Detroit for Tuesday, June 13th, 2023. We got some well-needed rain today, a perfect day to sit down and listen to a great story or read a book. Today's episode is with historian Craig Nelson. He is the author of V is for Victory, Franklin Roosevelt's American Revolution. This best-selling author shared how FDR confronted an American public disinterested in going to war in Europe, skillfully won their support, and pushed government and American industry to build the greatest war machine in history, the arsenal of democracy that won World War II. And, well, if you know anything about Detroit and Metro Detroit history, the arsenal of democracy, well, that's where we come in. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. Joining me on the line is Craig Nelson. He is the author of V is for Victory, Franklin Roosevelt's American Revolution and the Triumph of World War II. Craig, it's an honor to have you here with Daily Detroit.
I am pleased to be with Detroit, as you are a big hero in this book.
You know, really, I will say that I think it's the people that are a huge hero in this, too. I mean, obviously the factories and all the stuff that got done, but, you know, I'm related to, friends are related to, everything else. Like the story of the arsenal of democracy touched so many people in this region.
I really like to say that what this book is actually about is how the American people rose from despair, hopelessness, isolation, and poverty to defeat the greatest evil in human history. So it's quite a story.
Yeah. And so what called you to FDR? I know why I profiled him in my 5th grade history class, but I mean, you did a whole thing on it. Like it's a really compelling story. What drew you to start with FDR and get into the arsenal of democracy?
Well, it was really a strange story. So I've already done 2 World War II books, one on Pearl Harbor, so that was like the Navy's book, and one on a thing called the Doolittle Raid, so that was like the Air Force's book. And I really didn't want to do another World War II book. I was talking to a military analyst, and he said, you know, when it comes to the battlefield, logistics eat strategy for lunch. And all I could think of was, what are we World War II writers, what are we military historians doing? All we talk about is strategy. And then I started kind of falling down the rabbit hole of this. Logistics is the key to winning, and came up with that many people think World War II was won by the arsenal of democracy. And of course, the person behind all that was Franklin Roosevelt. And then if you look at World War II histories, Roosevelt is practically missing from all of them. So there's all combined into this enormous new book that was originally 1,100 pages, but thank God I got it down.
So another key thing, though, that Roosevelt had this that other leaders did not. He had an uncanny ability to navigate situations politically, put the right people in the right positions, move them when he needed to move them. Because when we're dealing with the arsenal of democracy, you're dealing with a number of industrialists that, I mean, to be fair, Henry Ford and the head of General Motors, like they weren't necessarily on board with everything from the bat for a variety of reasons.
Well, it's really amazing. But the first thing that I was really surprised to find, because I've always heard the people who hate him talk about FDR as a tyrant. And I like to say that he's the greatest politician in history, and I mean that in every sense of the word, because the more you know about him, the more you see why people couldn't stand him. But one thing that I thought was really interesting was that he had been slammed politically by trying to pack the Supreme Court and by trying to punish the Southern Dixiecrats who had gone against him politically. And he was really learned a lesson. So for all of the run-up to Pearl Harbor from 1938 to 1941, he never did one step ahead of public opinion. He would do polling, and he would do group meetings, and he would send out proxy people to argue on his behalf, but he would always stay within the mainstream of public opinion. And he did it step by step, from total isolation to we're ready to help England.
Now, am I right in when I read this book, I get the idea that FDR had a feeling that this was going to happen one way or another. It's more about how do I find ways to get ready for it? Or did I misread that?
No, he was one of the few people in the 30s to read Mein Kampf in the original German in the United States. And he was enraged that in the English translation left out some of the craziest parts of what Hitler had said. And he knew such things as that Alfred Rosenberg, who was a big Nazi philosopher, said that wouldn't it be great to have a Jew's head on every telephone pole from the North Sea to Berlin, which is about 500 miles. So he really knew how psychotic these people were and that they were something to be afraid of.
For sure. Then, you end up wrestling with figures that, as we look back in history, are very complicated. When I grew up, there was no complication about people like Henry Ford. Now, between what we know about what he did with, rubber plantations, what he did with his investments in various newspapers, with his policies, like Henry Ford has a very complex legacy, and it shows up in this story because he was no fan of Democrats. He was, actively anti-Semitic in some ways. He was like, it was a difficult thing to deal with him, but FDR had to because of the largesse and the skills that Ford could bring to the table.
Well, what I like to do in bringing back this period is to say that Detroit was the Silicon Valley of its age and that Ford Motor was Apple. And what Henry Ford did, he was really like, for many years, another Steve Jobs. He did this brilliant job of taking what everyone else was doing and putting it together and creating this incredibly efficient mass production system. And it was so great that he could dramatically raise his workers' wages so they could all buy Fords. I mean, it was just incredible. And then all of a sudden he turned. And we know that Lindbergh turned because his baby was kidnapped and murdered, but it's unclear why Ford did. All of a sudden, he's publishing these crazy anti-Semitic newspaper that all of the Ford retailers have to carry, saying things like Negro music, jazz, moron music, jazz, and all this kind of stuff. And finally, he sort of cut back on that, but he was still sort of insane and hostile to working with Roosevelt on the US of democracy. And it was really strange because Ford division in Germany was making things for the Nazis. Ford in England was making things for the British. And he just had this bug up his ass about working with Roosevelt. And then finally, Edsel, his son, mentioned him. Eleanor Roosevelt said on the radio that if the national emergency arises, the president can take over Ford Motor. And that changed his mind.
Well, I think that ties back to that FDR. When some people think of him as kind of like that rough and tumble political character, he also got it done, and he had the support. Although he often ruffled the feathers of those inside the Beltway, he ruffled the feathers of some industrialists while lining their pockets handsomely. Let's not forget, while all this consternation was happening, those companies were making tons of money. He was able to balance that together in a kind of brilliant way.
It really surprises me that the other guys who've written about the arts of democracy have always talked about how incredibly patriotic corporate chiefs were in joining the fight against Hitler. And they had guaranteed contracts that guaranteed all of their costs and then paid them an 8% profit on all of their sales. He's like, I would open a business tomorrow if I could get that deal. So I've never understood. And then, there's this big argument that Roosevelt was a socialist. Corporate profits doubled from 1940 to 1944. And there was never an administration in American history that was as tied to the economy and to boosting corporate earnings as the Roosevelt. So it really needs to be reassessed.
Oh, I think so too. And it's interesting to me to see that S word get thrown around because it still gets thrown around in today's media conversation, but it doesn't have a meaning to it or doesn't have its original meaning. Because if you look at FDR's wartime policies and things like that, he still ended up supporting private business a lot, and it ended up benefiting private business a lot. And it seems like that word just morphs in definition to be in the opposition of, as opposed to having a hard definition.
Yeah, I think it's an equivalent of saying immigrant. In one way, the immigrant is coming here to take your jobs, and the other way, they're coming here to sell drugs, but it's all called immigrant. And what's really amazing about him being called socialist is that two of his minor rules dramatically changed American business for the better. The first, that he established laws for Wall Street, that a company that wanted to sell stock had to release financial figures that had to be verified by independent auditors. Suddenly, anyone could invest in Wall Street and not feel like they were about to be taken to the cleaners. And he did the exact same thing with mortgages. With mortgages now, you could invest in selling mortgages, and banks could do them. Even outside of the regional banks could do it, because mortgages also had to have independent auditors verifying the financial worth. And that changed the American house buying system from 30% down on a 10-year mortgage to 10% down on a 30-year mortgage. And that dramatically boosts middle-class home ownership.
Oh, 100%. I don't think people realize beyond a certain generation. And, my grandmother was born in 1909 and my dad was born in the mid 30s. And they would both tell me how difficult it was to get a home. Like my grandmother would tell me that, this idea that so many people own their own homes, that wasn't a thing when she was growing up.
Exactly. And it really brought a stability to the finances of the United States, just to what he did with guaranteeing of bank deposits. He gave one speech that stopped the banking crisis. His first fireside chat told people, stop being afraid. The banks want to invest your money and make more money, and it's much better than keeping it in a mattress, and you're just driving yourselves crazy being afraid. And all of a sudden, the entire banking crisis was solved. But it was really solved in the long run by these guarantees. And before FDR came along, there were like 5,000 banks that had failed and had taken everyone's life savings with them. And afterward, I think there's something like 100 banks a year that fail. It's like almost not worth counting.
What are some of your favorite secondary characters in this book? For me, one of them is the Great Dane in William Knudsen, who ended up going and working, without the corporate support of his original employer and making a huge impact in so many ways. But what were some of your favorite secondary characters, and why did you feel important to talk about them so much?
So one of the things I really like doing as a historian for writing books that the general audience might like to read on the plane is because I get to restore heroes. I get to bring out unsung heroes and forgotten heroes. And in this book, there are a ton of them. There are even heroic economists. But one of the big stars is Bill Knudsen, who is the great all-American story. He arrives from Denmark with $30 in his pocket because he engineered the first bicycle built for two in Denmark. And then his first job is working on the docks in the Bronx, which I do not recommend. But he finds himself at a horseless carriage operation, and he goes to night school, and he learns about metallurgy, and he invents this alloy with another friend, which gets made into Oldsmobiles by Ransom Olds and into brake linings by Henry Ford. And Ford likes the company so much, he buys the whole thing, including Knudsen, and has it shipped to Highland Park. And now in Detroit, Knudsen dramatically expands Ford sales and operations. I think he increases the company 50%. Well, one of the things he does that's really incredible is he starts getting information back from the dealers and the repair operations in order to be able to sell more cars. So he was basically anticipating Google and Facebook and all those companies that follow us around all the time, hoovering up our data. He did that with cars in the 20s.
It reminds me that everything old is new again,
It really is, especially, if you look at this story, his successor, Donald Nelson, comes from Sears Roebuck, and Sears is exactly like Amazon. It had pioneered direct-to-consumer sales. It was towering above every other company. And he even Nelson made a joke about how he would talk to the press and he would go, my paper is bigger than any of yours. It's the Sears catalog. So these two men figured out this amazing thing. Knudsen had a very hard time because in order to redo the country from making cars to making bombers, you need to make all new machine tools, which like robots today, which make other robots, machine tools are the things that make other machines. They carve metal and they polish wood and they do all this kind of finishing. In fact, there's a fantastic show called How It's Made that stars machine tools. And it took so long to get the machine tools up and going that Knudsen got fired and replaced by Nelson, who figured out how to command the economy by overseeing four elements: carbon, steel, stainless, aluminum, and copper. And by directing where those went, he could balance the military and the civilian economies.
Yeah. It's interesting to me, too, to see the rise of the woman worker, which really that was not a thing in large ways before World War II into factories. And really the social change that started to begin there with that empowerment and those paychecks.
During the Depression, everyone hated women working because they thought it took jobs away from men who needed them. So they didn't like it then. And beforehand, they thought it was a terrible thing for a woman to do anything besides be behind the sales counter of a store selling something to another woman. But all of that broke loose because the Art of Democracy could never have worked without women workers. One of the joys of doing this book was I got to operate a rivet gun, which is basically like Rosie the Riveter, which is basically a machine gun that shoots bolts. So the idea, once you see what it's like, the idea of women doing it is like a mythological kind of thing, even though I found that there were 7 Rosie the Riveters. And my favorite story, though, is about a photographer who's being sent around by Yank magazine to take pictures of beautiful women on the assembly line. And he ends up at a drone plant in California. Before this book, I didn't even know there were drones in World War II. So that was great already. So he gets out of this plant and he meets this 18-year-old married woman whose husband is off in the Merchant Marine in the Pacific. And he just falls head over heels for her. It takes 2 weeks off his job so he can take pictures of her for a modeling portfolio. She booms onto the scene, is on the cover of 33 magazines. So she goes to 20th Century Fox and changes her name to Marilyn Monroe. So thank you, Arsenal Democracy, for giving us Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah, yeah. So many impacts. What was something that you thought you knew that you learned different in the research or the work for this book?
The really clear thing is Eleanor Roosevelt, who I thought was a sweet little grandma type person. And instead, she didn't need Secret Service protection because she always had a gun in her purse. And if anyone did her wrong politically, she went out and killed them. I mean, she's like a ninja in this book. But probably my favorite story about her is that she decided that she wanted to travel across the Pacific Theater and visit all the injured and dying men there. And no one wanted her to do it. The heads of the military really didn't want it because they had to set aside forces to protect her. And it was really a struggle for her to be able to do this. She goes out on this trip. She sees 400,000 injured and dying men. The Japanese try to bomb her twice. You know, she barely gets out of there. And she has the biggest impact of morale of anyone who ever goes there. And this is like all the big bands are going there. Betty Grable's going there. You know, everybody's going out there. And she has the biggest impact of anyone who'd been to the Pacific Theater. And Admiral Halsey wanted to know why, and he interviewed a little injured buck private who's probably dying. And the private said, she was someone we hadn't seen in so long, an American mother.
Yeah. Yeah. And her work so impactful even after the war. I mean, she was instrumental in the United Nations and so many other things.
She's so fantastic. There's one hilarious story where Roosevelt's getting elected to a 3rd term and no one wants to do it for him, but he doesn't want to appear at the convention to beg for the votes. So he sends down Eleanor and everyone's squabbling and yelling and screaming. And she stands up and says, you know, it's come a time. This is no ordinary time. It's a time we have to put aside our differences and work together for the future. And he and Wallace get nominated by popular acclaim. And she comes out of it and tells Harry Hopkins, you little lambs know nothing about politics.
You know, are there things from this that we can take with us today? You know, you see the amount of material produced and the manufacturing, and I know how much it really transformed Metro Detroit and Detroit. You wouldn't know this, but a few weeks ago I did a piece, you know, when all of that issues with the banks was happening, with the Silicon Valley Bank and everything, and realized that Detroit had had its own bank failures in the 30s that FDR's administration really helped, you know, get fixed and help try to get this city back on its feet again. And this manufacturing also really got a lot of money into people's pockets. Is there anything that from all of this, whether it's the Arsenal Democracy or Roosevelt or whatever, that we can take into 2023 as a lesson?
Well, normally, you know, historians don't like saying any of this, but there are so many lessons in this story. I don't know.
Let's break all the rules, Craig.
Since we're talking to Detroit, I want to begin by saying that I think it's outrageous that we have a big swath of our country called the Rust Belt, and that has been really done to de-rust that belt. And I think this book shows you that domestic manufacturing is a matter of national security, and we can't afford to not have manufacturing in the United States, for one thing. The second thing is that what Roosevelt did, for even if you hate him, the one thing that he did that was really incredible was he didn't just figure out the answer to people's financial problems. He ennobled them. In all of his speeches, he's lifting up Americans and making them feel better about themselves and saying, we're good, generous, gracious people. Let's help those English. You know, he's really like doing this incredible job. And that's something we just don't see in politicians anymore. And the final thing is that if there's a big enough threat, Americans can put aside their difference and come together and achieve almost anything. Because if this bunch of people were able to defeat Hitler, there's no telling what we could actually do if we stopped the squabbling and turned our forces together.
I think that is a great place to end it. Craig Nelson is the author of V is for Victory, Franklin Roosevelt's American Revolution and the Triumph of World War II, available wherever fine books are found. Craig, I really do appreciate your time today. It really was an honor.
It was an honor and a pleasure, and I so appreciate it. Thank you kindly.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. If you got feedback, dailydetroit@gmail.com. Tomorrow, action-packed show for you. The Fisher Building, iconic, historic landmark in Detroit's new center, purchased by Michigan State University. Robin Runyon from Urbanized Detroit, as well as our Norris Howard, will be joining us to talk all about that and other development. So throw in an email, dailydetroit@gmail.com, if you've got a question you want us to answer. With that, I am J.R. Stays. Thank you so much for listening to Your Daily Detroit. Don't forget to leave 5 stars for us somewhere like Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Remember that you are somebody, and we'll see you around Detroit.